Zuri Adams stepped through the polished glass doors of Rising Sun Dojo with a calm, quiet presence that betrayed none of the tension twisting in her gut. She was 12 years old, small for her age, and though her brown skin glowed against the soft afternoon light pouring in from the high windows, it also made her stand out in a sea of uniform whiteness, both in race and in attire, with students already lined up in pressed white GIs, buzzing in cliques, laughing among themselves, and giving her the kind of cursory glances that stung more than direct insults because they carried a weight of judgment wrapped in dismissive smirks. Her hair was neatly braided and pulled back in a low bun, her brand new GI still stiff from the packaging her mother had saved up for weeks to afford, and her belt, a white one, symbolic of her new beginning, was tied perfectly at the waist, though it barely hinted at the fire-forged experience beneath it. Her mother, working long, draining shifts as a night nurse, had driven an hour to drop her off before heading to her second job, leaving Zuri alone in this affluent suburb where she didn't know a soul, surrounded by manicured lawns and kids, with names like Braden and McKenna, whose parents arrived in Teslas and didn't bat an eye at monthly fees that nearly broke her mother's bank account. Zuri didn't speak much, not because she lacked words, but because she had long learned that people rarely heard her when she used them, that her voice was either overlooked or overanalyzed, twisted into something threatening or foolish. So, silence became her armor, a refuge she wrapped herself in since she first noticed how differently teachers treated her compared to her classmates, how quickly others assumed things about her, where she came from, what she could do, what she couldn't. As she stepped onto the mat and bowed low to Sensei Eric, a towering man with silver-streaked hair and the type of loud presence that demanded attention, he returned her bow but raised an eyebrow with a glint of skepticism, as if unsure what to make of this small black girl whose name sounded unique and whose gaze was steady but unreadable. "Welcome to Rising Sun," he said with forced cheer, but his voice lacked warmth, and when he gestured for her to join the beginners near the back, Zuri felt the hush that followed, the sudden dip in energy as if her presence had punctured the dojo's practiced rhythm. One boy, a blonde-haired kid named Tyler who already had a green belt, snorted and muttered to his friend, "What's she gonna do? Braid us into submission?" which triggered a cascade of muffled laughter, and a girl named Macy, with perfectly slicked back hair and a pink gym bag monogrammed with her initials, added, "You even know what karate is? Or are you lost?" A line delivered with such syrupy mockery that Zuri had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep her expression neutral. She said nothing, did nothing, just bowed once more, walked to the farthest mat without a word, and began stretching in a rhythm so controlled, so exact, it looked almost mechanical, her breath flowing evenly through each movement, her joints rotating like clockwork, but still, they watched her as if she didn't belong, as if she were an experiment that had wandered into their world by mistake. The next few classes were worse. Sensei Eric barely looked her way, pairing her with the youngest or weakest partners, offering corrections to others but bypassing her completely, and while Zuri followed every instruction to the letter, demonstrated clean, tight punches, grounded stances, fluid turns, she could feel the indifference radiating from him like steam off hot pavement. Tyler and his crew kept the jokes coming, calling her hood ninja and making whip-crack sounds behind her back every time she sparred, while Macy whispered loud enough for Zuri to hear, "She probably thinks karate's like breakdancing," drawing cruel laughter. Zuri absorbed it all in silence, but each time she bowed in and bowed out, she carried the insult-like weight in her limbs, and though no emotion touched her face, her knuckles grew tighter during drills, her balance sharper, her breath more precise. No one in the dojo knew that Zuri had spent the last 4 years training in another city, that she had already earned her black belt in Shotokan karate before her mother's job transfer forced them to move across state lines, or that her retired military combat instructor and Okinawan Goju practitioner had personally taught her stances, counters, and sparring techniques that could dismantle most black belts twice her size. When they moved, her mother had asked her gently, "Do you want to start over, baby? Try again, fresh?" And Zuri had nodded, agreeing to enter this new dojo as a beginner, both to avoid unwanted attention and to see the place for what it truly was, because her grandfather always said, "You'll learn more by watching than shouting," and so she watched, and she listened, and she trained alone at night in their small apartment living room, the carpet worn from her hours of katas and footwork drills, her muscles sore from knuckle push-ups and heavy bag kicks, her soul rooted in the rhythm of discipline that no one in that suburban dojo could even begin to understand. Coach Eric's lack of correction didn't bother her. It confirmed what she suspected. He didn't see her as someone worth investing in, and neither did the students, who took her silence as submission, her humility as fear, never realizing that restraint is a choice made by those with true power. Jordan, the self-proclaimed star of the dojo, a brown belt with a lean build and cocky grin, made a show of flashing kicks and rapid punches during every class, often glancing at Zuri like she was a shadow to be dismissed. One day, after a drill, he nudged her shoulder and said, "Bet I can drop you in 2 seconds, wanna try?" With that arrogant tone boys use when they're scared of what they don't understand. Zuri looked at him, just looked hand, then turned away without a word, a move that made his laughter falter and turned the other kids' grins into curious frowns. Her silence wasn't passive, it unsettled them more than any comeback could, because she didn't play their game, didn't feed their ego, didn't flinch or fume or cry. She endured like a coiled spring, waiting for the right pressure to trigger release. Her grandfather's teachings lived in her veins. Real warriors don't bark, they wait, and when the moment comes, they strike once, and the world goes quiet. She carried that lesson with her every day in the dojo, every moment someone sneered, every time Coach Eric overlooked her. Every drill she aced with clinical precision while others slacked and laughed and still got praise. And though the storm brewed around her, Zuri never broke character. She bowed when expected, trained harder than anyone, and kept her belt tied tight. Not to hide who she was, but to control how and when she revealed it. And deep down, a storm was building in her, quiet fire fed by every insult, every side eye, every offhand joke made about her skin, her silence, her strength. She could feel the pressure rising like steam behind a dam, waiting for the right crack, the right opportunity to let the world see what they'd ignored. And when it came, and it would come, she wouldn't need to shout, or warn, or explain. All it would take was one move, one perfectly executed strike, to remind everyone in that dojo, on that mat, in that town, that the quiet black girl they mocked wasn't just a student, she was a force they never saw coming. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the sky outside dark and swollen with thunderclouds, as if the universe itself were holding its breath, and inside the dojo the air carried an unusual electricity as Sensei Eric announced that they would be holding a sparring tournament to assess progress, rank dynamics, and natural ability. A phrase he used with an unsubtle glance that skipped over Zuri, like she was invisible, like her body didn't exist on the mat, and the students buzzed with excitement, clapping hands, high-fiving, already sizing each other up for victory while she remained kneeling, still and unreadable, heart calm even as her pulse quickened, with the knowledge that this would be the moment the blinders were stripped away, the curtain torn, the truth of her presence revealed not by word but by action, by mastery, by the weight of controlled power unleashed in the one place where the body could speak louder than anything else. She had waited for weeks, tolerated every microaggression, every side-eye snicker, every thinly veiled comment about her hair, her voice, her silence, all of which they thought would break her, all of which only sharpened her focus, honed her resilience like a blade under a whetstone. And now, as Sensei Eric posted the bracket with Jordan's name listed at the top in thick black ink and hers buried quietly at the bottom under Z, Adam's white, Zuri allowed the corners of her mouth to lift for the first time since stepping foot into that dojo, a fraction of a smile born not of cockiness but of knowing, of seeing fate align like puzzle pieces in her favor. Her first match was against a boy named Ryan, yellow belt with lanky limbs and a cocky streak, and as they bowed in and took their stances, he whispered just loud enough, "Don't be mad when I mess up your braids," and lunged without technique, without balance, just aggression, only to find himself flat on his back in 4 seconds. Zuri, never even shifting her expression as she pivoted, dropped her weight, and swept his leg with such fluid precision it looked like a scene from a film. And for the first time, the dojo went quiet, not shocked, quiet, but confused, like the air had been punched out of them and they didn't know why. Macy blinked, jaw slack, and Tyler muttered something under his breath while Sensei Eric narrowed his eyes slightly, but gave no praise, just nodded once and called the next match. But now there was tension in the air, subtle, crawling, the kind that follows the first crack in a glass surface. And by the time Zuri faced her second opponent, a girl with a blue belt and an ego twice the size of her skill, she could feel the shift in the room, the way people watched her differently now, uncertain whether what they saw the first time was a fluke or a flaring accident. But the second match ended in less than 10 seconds, Zuri blocking a clumsy high kick, slipping inside with a clean counterpunch to the chest that sent her opponent stumbling back so hard she fell off the mat. And this time, even Sensei Eric's expression twitched, the carefully practiced neutrality faltering for a breath before he moved on, saying only next with a voice tight around the edges. By the time she reached the semifinals, whispers had begun, low murmurs between students, sideways glances, hushed questions like, "Wait, how is she still a white belt? And did you see that last block?" Because now they were seeing her, not as a background figure, not as the quiet girl whose name they mocked or mispronounced, but as a force moving with impossible control, as a storm hidden inside a calm vessel. And when she stepped up to face Macy, the same girl who once asked if she was lost, the tension in the room knotted into something sharp and electric. Macy entered the match with overconfidence, masking her nerves, bouncing on her toes, face twisted into a forced smirk, whispering, "Don't take it personal when you lose," as if words could rattle Zuri, as if bravado could outclass discipline. And the moment the match began, Zuri simply flowed, her movements surgical, deliberate, as she evaded Macy's first 3 jabs without retreating an inch, letting the girl exhaust herself while she read every twitch in her shoulders, every shift in her balance, until finally, with one opening, Zuri slipped inside and landed a spinning back kick to Macy's ribs, not enough to injure, but enough to steal the breath from her lungs and send her sprawling onto the mat, gasping, dazed, humiliated. And the dojo erupted in murmurs, students now openly staring, trying to reconcile what they'd seen with what they thought they knew, with what they believed about girls who looked like Zuri, who didn't speak much, who didn't boast, who didn't come from gated neighborhoods or wear boutique GI bags. Sensei Eric couldn't ignore it. Now he walked over, examined Macy, called the match, and then looked at Zuri with a new layer of wariness in his eyes, as if the box he had tried to fit her in had exploded, and now he was staring at the unknown. And then came the final match, Zuri versus Jordan, the dojo's golden boy, the brown belt who had laughed the loudest, joked the hardest, trained the flashiest, and now stood across from her with clenched fists and an expression that shifted between confusion and simmering ego, bruised by the idea that someone like her could have climbed this far. "You got lucky," he muttered as they bowed in, his voice low and tight, "but let's see what you do against a real fighter." And as the match began, he came at her hard, using every ounce of his reach and speed, rapid punches and sharp kicks meant to intimidate, to corner, to dominate. But Zuri had danced with better fighters in bare-knuckle drills on hardwood floors at her grandfather's dojo, had been bruised by masters who taught her that pain is a lesson, not a threat. And now, in front of this stunned suburban crowd, she let go. She moved like water under pressure, like steel wrapped in silk, evading, blocking, countering with technique so pure it looked effortless, her timing impeccable, her breathing even, her eyes locked on Jordan's like a mirror reflecting every flaw in his form. And when he overextended on a roundhouse kick, his arrogance making him sloppy, Zuri stepped inside, pivoted her hips, and delivered one flawless, crushing sidekick to his midsection that landed with a crack of impact so sharp it silenced the room like a thunderclap. Jordan flew backward, hit the mat hard, and rolled once before lying flat, gasping, clutching his side while the dojo stood in stunned disbelief. Even Sensei Eric frozen in place, mouth slightly open, as if trying to understand how the girl he'd written off had just dismantled his best student with the grace of a seasoned warrior. Zuri bowed, turned, and walked off the mat without a word, her face calm, eyes steady, back straight, not triumphant, not cocky, but grounded, as if the victory meant nothing to her, because in truth, it didn't, not in the way they thought. It wasn't about beating Jordan, or Macy, or Ryan. It was about revealing what they refused to see, that strength has no look, no voice, no neighborhood, that power can walk in quiet, brown-skinned and soft-spoken, and still shake the room. Sensei Eric approached her afterward, slower than usual, and for the first time his voice held hesitation, a crack in his tone as he said, "Zuri, I didn't know you had that level of experience. Where did you train?" And she looked up at him with a gaze that pierced, her voice low but clear. "I've been training my whole life. You just didn't ask." He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came, because what could he say? How could he defend ignoring her, misjudging her, misplacing her in a system designed to elevate loudness over discipline, flash over depth? The students were watching now, not mocking, not snickering, but watching with a kind of awe that bordered on reverence. And Zuri felt it shift, the weight of silence finally turning in her favor. Not because she shouted, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. Earned it with every kick, every block, every silent moment she endured without breaking. And now, walking off the mat while Jordan still sat breathless and stunned, she knew she had not just won a match, she had shattered an illusion, appended a narrative, and rewritten what power could look like in that space, forever. The dojo felt different now, not just quieter but reverent, like every movement made in that space was being recalibrated around a new center of gravity. Zirian, though she had returned just as she always had, wearing the same white belt, same simple GI, same quiet footsteps padding across the mat. Her presence now carved silence into the room in a way even the most dominant brown belts couldn't replicate, and it wasn't fear that followed her, it was something deeper, the kind of awareness that can't be taught, only learned after watching a myth take human form. Because after that kick, after the video had spread like wildfire through group chats, rival dojos, and even local martial arts forums with captions like "One Kick, KO" and "Quiet Girl, Lethal Strike," everything shifted. Macy no longer tossed side comments about hair or urban music. Tyler had stopped trying to impress the class with loud kais that cracked like toy drums. And Jordan, once the untouchable dojo prince, had missed 2 classes in a row, citing an injury, though everyone suspected it was more pride than pain. And even Coach Eric had changed subtly, offering Zuri slightly longer glances, more respectful nods, though still never acknowledging what she had done directly, almost as if admitting her skill would unravel his carefully maintained pecking order. And yet, Sensei Watanabe, who had watched her from the back with eyes that missed nothing, stepped forward that Monday after warm-ups and said simply, "We begin with kata. Zuri, lead." It wasn't a question, and the class froze, turning slowly to look at her, unsure if they'd heard correctly. But she nodded, stepped forward, and launched into Heian Shodan with a form so crisp, so deeply internalized. It was like watching a blade. Remember, it was forged in fire. Every step, every turn, every block struck the air with silent conviction. And as she reached the final pose, low stance, hand extended, no one breathed, until Sensei Watanabe said, "Again," and again she performed, and again the room leaned forward, not just watching but studying her now, their postures unconsciously mimicking hers, until finally he clapped once, said, "Learn from her," and walked off the mat, leaving Coach Eric speechless and the class more attentive than they'd ever been. The following week, a tournament invitation arrived, regional qualifiers hosted by a major dojo known for producing national-level fighters, and, as Coach Eric read the details aloud, students buzzed with nervous energy until he said the names of those chosen to compete: Macy, Tyler, a senior brown belt named Kai, and then after a pause, Zuri Adams, and the room didn't laugh, didn't smirk, just turned to look at her with a kind of hesitant admiration, as if finally allowing themselves to believe what they had seen. Preparation began immediately, with longer training hours, partner drills, and intense sparring sessions. And though Macy avoided Zuri at first, it was clear that even she couldn't ignore the shift until one afternoon. She approached Zuri during a water break, hesitated, then muttered, "You wanna drill kicks with me?" And Zuri nodded without speaking, and they trained in silence, sweat and bruises replacing old tension with something harder to defend. And yet, amid this newfound clarity, pressure began to build, because with visibility came expectations, and expectations became assumptions, and those assumptions began to weigh on Zuri like invisible bricks stacked on her shoulders, not because she feared failure, but because she knew now they were watching not just the dojo, but everyone who had ever dismissed her, doubted her, who had seen the viral video and assumed she would win again and again, like she was a machine, like her body was not capable of strain, of fatigue, of doubt. And though she never spoke of it, her nights became heavier, dreams more restless, often waking with her grandfather's voice echoing in her ears, reminding her of the time he warned, "The weight of proof is heavier when they don't expect you to carry it." And she trained harder, alone after class, repeating forms in the dark while her knuckles stung and her knees trembled, determined not to become a one-kick legend but a storm they would never forget. The night before the tournament, she sat quietly in her room, GI laid out, belt coiled like a promise, and though her mother offered words of love, and her grandfather called to remind her of her lineage, of the power of her ancestors walking with her, Zuri felt something shift inside, not fear, but fire, a rising certainty that she wasn't just fighting for a trophy. She was fighting to reclaim space, to define excellence on her own terms, to make sure that every girl who looked like her, who was ever told to sit in the back, to keep quiet, to shrink herself, would see her and remember they never had to. And when she arrived at the tournament the next morning, the arena was buzzing with movement, hundreds of athletes, coaches, judges, families, banners, mats, all clashing under bright lights, and, Yet the moment she stepped onto the floor, everything else fell away, replaced by her breath, her heartbeat, her discipline. Her first match was against a girl from a wealthy dojo in Midtown, a red belt with expensive gear and 2 instructors flanking her like security, but none of that mattered, because Zuri moved with a clarity the girl couldn't read, couldn't match, and in under 20 seconds, she landed a reverse punch that halted the match cold. Her second match, more difficult, pitted her against a tall green belt with aggressive footwork and heavy strikes, but Zuri absorbed his energy like water against rock patient, calculating until a sidestep and rising knee ended it. With each round, murmurs followed her, whispers of "that's the girl from the video, she's a white belt, no, she's something else." And by the time she reached the semifinals, coaches were standing to watch, judges leaning in, closer, the other competitors glancing nervously toward her corner. Coach Eric, uncharacteristically silent, stood with arms folded, eyes darting between Zuri and the bracket board, while Sensei Watanabe watched with that same calm knowing in his gaze, the quiet certainty of a man who had seen many storms but recognized when one had arrived early. Then came the final match, Zuri versus a first-degree black belt named Layla from a rival dojo. Fast and brutal, with a reputation for knocking out opponents and a chip on her shoulder so large it seemed to enter the ring before she did. They bowed, locked eyes, and Zuri felt the air tighten like a drumhead. And when the referee shouted begin, Layla attacked, instantly relentless, precise, testing Zuri's defense with combinations sharp enough to draw gasps, but Zuri absorbed, shifted, flowed, never breaking rhythm, until the final 30 seconds when she exploded forward with a counter combination, so perfect it stopped time, a rising block, a pivot, and a back leg roundhouse kick that landed clean against Layla's shoulder, sending her stumbling back across the mat. The crowd erupted, and though the score was close, the judges ruled unanimously winner Zuri Adams, and as her name echoed across the arena, as she bowed and stepped off the mat, sweat pouring, heart steady, the cheers washed over her like a tide, but inside, she remained grounded, unshaken. For this wasn't a culmination, it was a beginning. Back at the dojo the following week, a framed photo of the tournament winners hung on the wall, and Zuri's name now appeared on the attendance board in gold marker, not as a white belt, not as a mystery, but as a leader. And when a group of new students arrived, little girls with brown skin and big eyes, one of them pointed to Zuri and whispered, "Is that her?" And the others nodded, awestruck, as Zuri turned, smiled softly, and walked toward them, ready to teach, ready to show that quiet does not mean weak, and that true power needs no introduction, just one kick, one chance, one girl brave enough to rise in silence and let her spirit speak. The final chapter of Zuri's quiet revolution began not with a fight, but with a question that echoed through the dojo louder than any shout: "Can I train with her?" It came from a newcomer, a small boy with autism whose parents had nearly pulled him out after his first class, but who had watched Zuri from the sidelines, mesmerized by the grace in her movements, the calm in her breathing, the way she didn't just strike targets, she studied them, listened to the rhythm of the room, then entered it on her terms. And as Coach Eric hesitated, unsure how to structure a class around this new dynamic, Zuri rose without being asked, offered her hand, and simply said, "We can start slow." That moment, small to some, seismic to others, cracked open the dojo's understanding of power, revealing that mastery wasn't in domination, but in elevation, in making space for others to grow without fear of ridicule or rejection. And it didn't stop there, because once the floodgates opened, students who had previously lingered in the margins, too anxious, too soft-spoken, too different, began to gather near Zuri during drills, forming an unspoken circle of trust around her where perfection wasn't required to belong, only effort, only intention. And though she continued her own training, pushing herself through brutal solo sessions, sweat-heavy kata repetitions, and hours of refining footwork that even Sensei Watanabe would later say rivaled black belts twice her age, Zuri never stopped. Teaching, never stopped encouraging, even as whispers began to circulate about her being nominated for a junior teaching assistant role by the dojo's board, a rare honor usually reserved for upper belts and senior students, but no one protested. Because by now, the truth was undeniable. Zuri was the dojo's core, not by title but by influence, by integrity, by example. And when Watanabe returned for a seasonal seminar and invited her to demonstrate advanced techniques alongside him, she didn't boast or gloat, she bowed, performed, and returned to her place in line as if nothing had changed, though everything had, and the room responded in kind. Even the dojo itself seemed transformed, Posters of past champions were now joined by a new framed image, Zuri mid-kick, frozen in the air from that legendary match, captioned with the words, "Quiet is not weak." Parents began enrolling, daughters specifically hoping they'd train under her. Older students humbled themselves to ask her for feedback. Coach Eric, once unsure of how to manage her presence, now built drills around her leadership style. Structured.com relentlessly focused and admitted privately to another instructor that she had taught him more about patience than any seminar ever had. But Zuri didn't care for accolades. She still walked to the dojo the same way, laced her GI the same, tied her belt with the same methodical, loop-centered, precise balance, because what she chased wasn't attention but alignment, not with fame or pride, but with her own sense of truth, the rhythm her grandfather taught her to hear when he whispered late at night, "Our strength is not in how we shout, but in how we stand when no one sees us." And yet, people were watching now, schools inviting her to speak on discipline, reporters requesting interviews for youth martial arts magazines, even national karate associations reaching out with sponsorship inquiries. But Zuri, as always, remained selective, choosing only to appear in places where her story could inspire without being diluted, where other quiet kids, especially black girls, so often silenced, could see someone who looked like them commanding space without apology. And when the Rising Sun Dojo hosted its first all-girls sparring day, Zuri was asked to open the event with a keynote, and she stood at the center mat, hundreds of young faces staring at her. Expecting something grand, and she simply said, "You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be ready when the moment comes." And the applause that followed was not just for the words, but for the weight of them, for the journey they carried. In the months that followed, Zuri began writing a guide for younger students, mix of personal stories, training techniques, and reflections on finding strength without violence, titled "The Stillness Before the Strike," which soon became required reading for white belts in the region. And not long after, Watanabe formally offered her the black belt that had once been denied by assumption, presenting it before a crowd of parents and students during the end of ceremony. But Zuri, standing barefoot on the mat, only took the belt after bowing to the newest class of students, signaling that the honor was not just hers but shared. She tied it around her waist, not with triumph, but with quiet reverence. And when the applause faded, she stepped forward, turned to the crowd, and bowed, not as a prodigy, not as a viral sensation, but as a leader forged through silence, patience, and one unforgettable moment of truth. And so the dojo changed, not just in structure or form, but in culture, becoming a place where voices once buried beneath laughter and doubt now rose with clarity and purpose, where strength was redefined every time a shy kid lifted their fists with trembling confidence because Zuri had shown them it was possible. And the final class of the year felt less like an end and more like the continuation of a movement, as students lined up, bowed, and clapped in unison while Watanabe addressed them. "There are fighters who come and go," he said, eyes resting on Zuri, "and then there are those who change the way we understand what it means to fight, not with anger, not with volume, but with spirit." And as Zuri helped roll up the mats that night, refusing to let others do it for her, one of the youngest girls, no older than 6, tugged at her sleeve and asked shyly, "Will I ever kick like you?" And Zuri knelt, placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder, and said, "You already can. It's not in the leg, it's in the belief." And with that, the legacy was sealed, not just in medals or photos, but in every whisper turned into a roar, every doubt turned into discipline, every quiet girl standing taller because one of their own had once been mocked, dismissed, underestimated, and answered the noise with a single, unforgettable kick.